The nation of Somalia has been in a state of constant crisis for decades. But if the affairs of 2025 thus far have set the tone for what comes next, then one of the world's most profoundly broken, failed states may be about to endure its worst period since the height of the civil war in the 90s. Over the last several months, the brutally violent terror organization al-Shabaab has crashed through Somali defenses in a critical part of the country and proving in real time that the Somali government forces cannot challenge them. Today, headed into what is very likely to be a bloody summer, that al-Shabaab offensive has forced Somalia into a new stage of war, a siege. It's the city of Mogadishu in the crosshairs. It's al-Shabaab with the power to choose what happens next. And right now, the fate of an entire nation hangs in the balance. The situation is terribly underreported. Global powers have been very sluggish to respond, and if something does not change soon, then life is about to become very horrific for the people in al-Shabaab's crosshairs. The siege of Mogadishu has begun, and al-Shabaab is firmly in control. Alright, so in order to understand what's been happening in Somalia over the last several months, we first have to understand the lay of the land in Somalia more generally, because in this particular conflict, it's impossible to separate the fighting between Mogadishu and al-Shabaab from the wider state of the nation. To call the Somali federal government a federal government at all is to severely overestimate the power of the nation's internationally recognized leaders. Since the 1990s, Somalia has been at the top of the leaderboard by just about every metric used to identify a failed state, where the government of a given nation has proved unable to fulfill basic functions from domestic security and law enforcement to tax collection to maintaining critical infrastructure. In the mid-2020s, Somalia ranks alongside nations like Haiti, Yemen, and the Central African Republic, the most institutionally broken among the broken. In those sorts of states, large portions of the nation are completely outside the control of the federal government, and an inept, corrupt leadership has shown that it's either unwilling or unable to address the situation on behalf of its people. In Somalia's case, that's meant a situation in which 2/3 of the nation's people are considered to live in multi-dimensional poverty, including not just poverty in wealth, but in access to food, shelter, or basic medical services. The nation hasn't held nationwide legislative elections since the 1960s. Its law enforcement and judicial systems can't even fulfill the most basic of civil functions consistently, and both insurgent and criminal violence are widespread throughout the nation. In 2024, Somalia put up a score of just 9 out of 100 on the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, second worst in the entire world, whereas on Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index, also out of a potential 100 points, Somalia earns just 8. Healthcare and education are practically non-existent in large portions of the country, and corruption is so pervasive that it's simply just become a facet of everyday life. Complicating the situation further is the fact that the Somali government can only exert direct control over a relatively small share of its own territory. In the northwest, the autonomous government of Somaliland is, for all intents and purposes, basically a sovereign entity, much to Mogadishu's chagrin. While Somaliland has historically struggled to do business or receive investment internationally because of its officially non-sovereign status, it's recently become a more frequent partner of other nations like Ethiopia and the Emirates that have sought to go over Mogadishu's head to operate in the area. In Somalia's northeastern tip, the region of Puntland is also functionally independent, and in 2024, it officially rejected the authority of the Somali government and declared itself a sovereign entity. The southern Juba Valley, also known as Jubaland, is moving toward a similar status, and its regional government has clashed directly with Somali federal forces over the last year. Independent clans often exert direct control over local lands, where Mogadishu's influence only carries as much weight as the clans allow, and relatively small insurgent groups, including the Islamic State in Somalia, can achieve their own form of local control at times. And then there's al-Shabaab, which was founded in 2006 as a youth militia under Somalia's Islamic courts and properly known as Hakarat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, al-Shabaab has become a highly potent military force, gathering support from Somalis first as a resistance organization against Ethiopian occupation, and then as an expression of jihadist fundamentalist Islam, especially after it pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda in 2012. Over time, the group has morphed into a powerful, asymmetric insurgency, capable and willing to attack within Ethiopia and Kenya, but focused on waging a militant terrorist campaign against the government in Mogadishu. In 2022, it was estimated to have up to 15,000 fighters or more under its banner, and at that time, it controlled large portions of southern and central Somalia. In those areas, its fighters instituted their extreme interpretation of Sharia law and established a launchpad for large-scale attacks in both Somalia and Ethiopia. That all changed in the later months of 2022, when an offensive by the Somali government, drawing on support from the African Union and the United States, started taking back territory that al-Shabaab had captured. Within just a few months, al-Shabaab had been booted out of a fair portion of the Somali heartland, with their territory chopped up, their fighters isolated from each other, and their supply and smuggling routes fundamentally disrupted. Now, the success of the Somali government in that offensive came from a wide variety of contributing factors, but two in particular definitely stood out. Those included the staunch military support of foreign allies, especially air power, and the ability of the Somali Federal Forces to basically split its ground forces into two types. The nation's specially trained shock troops, including a brigade called Danab that we've covered separately on this channel, were able to act as the tip of the spear, clearing territory, meeting al-Shabaab in the rapid, asymmetrical fight it prefers, and keeping the jihadists on the back foot. Then, the bulk of the Somali military could send troops to hold that territory where, despite those troops' poor training, low morale, and limited resources, they could park themselves on captured territory with enough guns and bodies that a retreating al-Shabaab just couldn't justify an organized counter-offensive. As for the foreign powers at work in Somalia, the bulk of the international military support for Mogadishu comes from the African Union, where several intervention efforts have come and gone with time. From 2007 to 2022, it was the African Union Mission to Somalia, or AMISOM, replaced in 2022 by the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, or ATMIS. In early 2024, ATMIS boasted a strength of about 13,500 uniformed soldiers and over 1,000 police, hailing mostly from Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Burundi. Critically, at the end of 2024, ATMIS was supposed to hand over its mission to ALSOM, the African Union Stabilization Support Mission in Somalia, but a combination of political and financial pressure from Ethiopia and international concern over human rights abuses by prior African Union deployments have been a major barrier in getting the mission deployed effectively. Along with the African Union, the United States has played a role in Somalia for many years and redeployed troops to the nation in 2022 at the same time that Somalia's anti-al-Shabaab offensive ramped up. The US launches frequent airstrikes in the region even today, although over the last couple of years it's mostly targeted Islamic State operatives in the Puntland region. And just before we continue today, we'd like to quickly say that we have a brand new channel called Political Fronts, which, as you could probably tell from the name, covers the more political stuff that we didn't really want to put on this channel. You can check it out. There's a link below. Also, there's a link below to our newsletter, which goes out twice a week, covering stuff that is maybe a little too short or a little too obscure for this channel, even though we like to think we do go obscure sometimes. There's also a link to the newsletter below, so check that out, sign up. Both of those things are completely free, so enjoy. And now let's move on. As the calendar shifted from 2024 to 2025, the map of territorial control in Somalia looked fairly decent for Mogadishu. Somaliland, Puntland, and the other autonomous or semi-autonomous regions were still posing problems, but al-Shabaab was divided, beaten down, and apparently on the decline. In 2024, the group committed fewer attacks than it had in 2023, including over 20% fewer attacks on civilians and 35% fewer civilian fatalities. The mood in Somalia was one of guarded optimism, with a recent crisis over Somaliland seemingly dealt with, a flare of violence in Jubaland resolved for the time being, and the Islamic State beaten down by American airstrikes in the nation's northeast. But that all changed on February the 20th, 2025, when al-Shabaab launched a series of coordinated attacks across several southern villages. Targeting local militias and outposts of the federal government, al-Shabaab zeroed in on an area on opposite sides of the border between two Somali provinces, Hiran and Middle Shabelle. Shortly after the first wave of attacks, the Somali government claimed victory, announcing that it had killed over 130 al-Shabaab fighters and repelled a series of assaults. The United States pitched in too, launching multiple airstrikes to assist Somali forces in standing firm. But over the next several days, it became clear that al-Shabaab's latest attack was more than a failed attempt at a hit and run. The group circulated evidence that suggested that it had, in fact, been able to overrun defensive positions and temporarily occupy multiple towns, and on the following day, the group pivoted to other targets in Middle Shabelle. Again, it was able to briefly claim control of multiple towns, and a few days later, it did the same thing, launching another group of attacks on the 25th and capturing one of the towns it invaded unopposed. Another city was ultimately overrun, as was a major military base. A couple of days later, a surprise al-Shabaab attack in a district just 30 kilometers from Mogadishu managed to force out unprepared soldiers, with the group establishing local control in the streets before quickly ducking out when a coordinated counter-assault began. Shortly after that, al-Shabaab started capturing other towns, and once al-Shabaab started gathering momentum, it proved so very difficult to stop. Although it had been beaten back by the government offensive in 2022, al-Shabaab never lost territorial control in much of the south-central Somali heartland. The group did suffer geographic disruption, fractured and forced to operate carefully while sneaking through government-controlled zones. But it retained control in many patches of land, at times able to spare dozens or even hundreds of fighters from those locations. They, in turn, could attack asymmetrically from unexpected angles, joining forces here, launching a diversion there, and forcing Somali troops into a reactive posture. Nor did al-Shabaab focus on attacking major Somali targets like large military bases or population centers. Instead, they were focused on the spaces between the zones they still controlled to consolidate their territory, capturing bridges of lands that would allow passage from one zone to another and whittling down the Somali forces that were stationed in the middle. Using a combination of car bombs, light armored raids, and foot soldiers, al-Shabaab was able to rapidly force Somali forces onto the back foot. See, the problem with how Somalia had captured all that territory back in 2022 by a combination of foreign-backed shock troops to take land and high volumes of low-quality troops to hold it is that it's a strategic approach that really only works when the nation using that approach is on an offense. When the tables have turned and an army with that structure is asked to go on defense, a high-powered, high-intensity asymmetric threat is primed to exploit every weak spot at once. But they can't be in that many places at once. If they're forced to dart around a large battle zone and react to threats as they emerge, they lose both their operational potency and their ability to respond in great enough numbers that they have a tactical advantage. Meanwhile, the large zones that those shock troops can't defend are left in the hands of troops who can charitably be described as under-equipped for the situation in which they find themselves. Lacking the training, the equipment, and the ideological and financial incentives to stay in the fight, those troops will often convince themselves and each other to abandon areas even before al-Shabaab shows up, including when they're at a significant numerical advantage. If they have to engage in a head-to-head battle, the results run the gamut. Some will be able to offer some resistance before defeat, surrender, or retreat, but others will just lay down their arms or be slaughtered as a reward for their bravery. As al-Shabaab's momentum grows stronger, as rumors of their battlefield successes spread, the psychological effect only grows, and before long, Somalia's regular troops are unwilling to engage in a fight in anything but the most dire of circumstances. Even if Somalia's shock troops are able to respond and support them, they're likely to find their own comrades in disarray, beating a hasty retreat, or already gone. And at the same time as they proved able to distract Somalia's shock troops and target areas defended by troops of lesser quality, al-Shabaab demonstrated its proficiency with sleight of hand and diversion tactics. The attack on the district close to Mogadishu was one such example, a disruptive assault that wasn't meant to capture and hold a stretch of territory, but instead to create a crisis in the Somali backlines and force the government to respond. On the same day as the attack near Mogadishu, al-Shabaab fired mortar shells into other parts of the city, creating the opening they'd use for their brief attack. On March the 11th, they bombed an important hotel that was used by the military to coordinate Somali counter-offensives and occupied it over the course of a day-long siege. A few days after that, al-Shabaab militants started popping up and carrying out nighttime patrols in areas where they weren't previously known to be active, just one day after they nearly assassinated Somalia's president as he was traveling by convoy. In early April, al-Shabaab was able to hit the presidential palace in Mogadishu with a mortar barrage. Each time, those attacks have forced Somali soldiers to pivot rapidly and defend new areas, siphon away troops to perform unexpected security operations, and deplete their forces on or near the front lines. All the while, al-Shabaab's daily attacks have taken a similar approach, saturating target areas with distracting or misdirecting mini-assaults so that by the time the main thrust begins, defenders are already in a state of panic and disarray. As February wore into March and March into April, it became all the more obvious that al-Shabaab had the upper hand. What had initially been encroachments and brief occupations of towns and villages turned into permanent takeovers after al-Shabaab kept up the pressure on given targets for a few days and forced a federal retreat. Once they gained control of relatively secure areas, al-Shabaab built makeshift bridges and other infrastructure that allowed fighters to navigate the landscape faster and in larger numbers. They brought with them a growing stockpile of captured weapons and heavy equipment left behind by Somali forces as they retreated. A rainy season that was expected to restrict al-Shabaab's mobility as the dry landscape gave way to mud and short-lived rivers instead proved to be mild. As more al-Shabaab zones of control were reconnected to the rest, the group only grew stronger, with Somali regular forces increasingly deciding to turn tail and run before the jihadists ever encroached on their positions. Al-Shabaab captured areas on the outskirts of Mogadishu, then the outlying neighborhoods, and then the major roads and freeways leading in and out of the city. With government forces isolated either inside or outside of the capital, al-Shabaab was able to focus pressure on more important strategic targets, taking larger towns, small cities, and military camps. They were able to lure more elite or capable units into unfavorable firefights, even killing the leader of the Dadaab Special Forces on April the 9th. A day later, reports emerged that hundreds of police officers had gone missing or perhaps even joined al-Shabaab, the latest in a series of signs that the group's numbers have swelled in the last few months. In response, Somali shock troops were able to notch notable victories, at times with high al-Shabaab body counts to go along with it. But even in victory, those shock troops were plagued by the same problems that we've discussed previously. They can take a target area, but by themselves they can't hold that area. And once control passes back to Somalia's regular troops, it's only a matter of time before they're pushed out again. High desertion rates have only complicated matters, to the point that Somalia's decaying military morale has been implicated as a major contributor to al-Shabaab's success. The problem's so severe that Somali leaders, military commanders, and even religious elders have taken to denouncing deserters, even threatening that their parents could face execution for their actions. But those threats only appear to have made the problem worse. Airstrikes from the United States, the Emirates, and Ethiopia did help matters somewhat, but air power alone wasn't nearly enough to turn the tide, and Somalia's soldiers proved unable to do the rest. At the time of writing, precise casualty counts are not known for either side, with neither al-Shabaab nor Mogadishu known to provide honest figures to describe their own losses. But at a minimum, many hundreds of fighters have died on either side, and the death toll may crest into the thousands. For al-Shabaab, the crowning moment of the offensive thus far came on April the 16th, less than 2 months after the push began. On that day, al-Shabaab overran the strategic town of Adan-Yabal, and with it, a series of 10 surrounding outposts previously under control of the Somali military. Adan-Yabal was an especially important target for both sides, as it's been used as a staging area for Mogadishu to launch counterattacks, and it served as a critical bastion that prevented al-Shabaab from truly consolidating its control around Mogadishu. According to some sources, after heavy initial fighting, a force of about 100 al-Shabaab fighters may have forced over 2,500 government soldiers and militia fighters into a rout, including the Somali National Army's chief of staff and the chiefs of Somalia's military courts. On the same day, al-Shabaab captured the village of Abu Ray, an essential node in the supply lines of the Somali military, and one without which remaining points of resistance across the outer front line were likely to crumble. In the following days, al-Shabaab consolidated its dissenting civilians, weathering largely ineffective airstrikes and building up defensive positions to ensure that a counterattack is unlikely. With that, the group reconsolidated the vast majority of the territory that had been lost in 2022 and set itself up in an arguably stronger position than ever before. Since the capture of Abu Ray and Aden-Yabal, the al-Shabaab offensive has slowed dramatically in pace as the jihadists work to tighten their grip on areas that they've already conquered. Relative to the previous few months, May has also been almost quiet across Somalia. But that relative absence of major battles should not be taken to mean that al-Shabaab's ambition has now been satisfied. Instead, the conquest of Aden-Yabal marked the conclusion of al-Shabaab's Phase 1, ushering in a period of consolidation before the start of an inevitable Phase 2. Al-Shabaab has never been vague about its intentions in Somalia. In the jihadists' ideal world, they swell to a size and strength that allows them to capture Mogadishu, overthrow the Somali government, and establish their own caliphate, which they'd subsequently expand to encompass East Africa. Now al-Shabaab has encircled Mogadishu from the outskirts and started a siege, with the logical next step being a direct push on the capital. Recent history provides not one, not two, but 3 similar examples of a non-state insurgency doing precisely that after achieving a stunning series of victories over the governments of their respective nations. Those include the Taliban assault on Kabul in 2021, the assault on Damascus by Syrian rebels in 2024, and the Congolese rebel group M23's push toward the capital of Kinshasa earlier this year. Although M23 halted its Kinshasa push for other reasons, the overall sequence of events was similar in all 3 cases. The rebel groups pulled off lightning assaults in areas where government forces were supposed to be able to resist them and then barrel down major highways before, in the cases of Syria and Afghanistan, thundering into the capital city. But although it certainly wouldn't be beyond al-Shabaab to attempt something similar, the early indicators would suggest that the jihadists in Somalia will actually take another route. A run on Mogadishu would come with the same obstacles that other non-state rebels have faced over the last few years. Obstacles that regular viewers of this channel may remember from our coverage of the civil war in Myanmar. Now, in that example, although a rebel coalition has now captured most of the country from a similarly inept, similarly retreat-happy military regime, they've struggled to break through into the urban areas where the regime is at its strongest. There, the regime's forces can concentrate in far higher numbers with more and better equipment, consistent air support, and the knowledge that they are backed against a wall where retreat is no longer an option. The same is true for al-Shabaab, who are well aware that the same Somali regulars who fled the countryside to save their own skins will understand that fighting to the death is their only option now that they're pinned down. Not only that, but Somalia's elite shock troops will now be concentrated in high enough numbers that they could defend the few points of ingress that al-Shabaab could use, while Somalian international air power can concentrate fire on those same limited areas. In short, while al-Shabaab could certainly make its best attempt at storming the capital, its odds of success are far lower in a direct, linear assault than when it could attack its enemies asymmetrically in the countryside. More likely, and seemingly confirmed by al-Shabaab's decision to hold its perimeter thus far, is the option in which al-Shabaab decides to slow-cook Mogadishu until it collapses. Unlike Myanmar, Somalia is a nation where the capital and other government-controlled areas aren't that much wealthier or better prepared for a siege than its more remote towns and villages. All those problems that have pushed Somalia into failed state status are just as prevalent in Mogadishu as anywhere else. The chaos, the unchecked corruption, the crime, the poverty, and the lack of access to important resources. Even under normal circumstances, Mogadishu is a city under pressure, and now that it's encircled with the full knowledge that it's under siege, that pressure will only grow. Al-Shabaab's role, then, is to crank up the pressure as high as it possibly can, and unfortunately for Mogadishu, that's a plan that plays directly into al-Shabaab's greatest strengths. Before al-Shabaab was a large-scale insurgency during its alternating growth and defeat periods in the countryside, and even today, it has always been a terrorist organization above all else. The group's understanding and use of terror tactics, its capacity for innovation, and its willingness to chase a high body count are unparalleled even in the world of transnational jihad. Already, the terror attacks have begun, with a suicide bomber killing 10 people at an army recruitment drive in the capital, other bombers attacking a military base, and mortar shelling becoming a fact of life in some parts of the city. With time to figure out ways inside Mogadishu to build its patented truck bombs and place them in position, al-Shabaab can heighten the rate of mass casualty attacks inside Mogadishu until they are constant. The group has already shown that it can target the president and his palace, and with military and government targets now well within its range, al-Shabaab may even opt for a lower rate of more carefully crafted attacks meant to create panic among the nation's ruling elite. The question to ask now is the question of how long a pressure cooker like Mogadishu can withstand a long-term terror campaign before it descends into anarchy. Because once a state of anarchy sets in, al-Shabaab will have achieved the conditions needed for a direct assault on the capital. As for ways that the government in Mogadishu can turn the tables, current indicators would suggest that relief is unlikely. The capital isn't totally encircled yet, but it's not far from that benchmark, and a counteroffensive thrust into the bulk of al-Shabaab territory would be suicide even for forces that were considerably more willing to risk their lives than Somalia's troops have been. Nor will reinforcements be able to break through from other areas. To the north, Puntland and Somaliland have been largely disinterested in helping out. In the south, semi-autonomous Jubaland has sent its own elite dervish forces to fight alongside elements of Somalia's shock troop brigades, but although they have the numbers and strength to prevent al-Shabaab from capturing the south, they seem to lack the ability to break through to the capital. Outlying clans in central Somalia have mostly decided they're better off standing aside, or in some cases have aligned with al-Shabaab directly in hopes of ensuring that they'll be on the winning side. The few militias that do still resist are mostly looking to assert control over their own lands and lack the strength and the will to extend themselves toward Mogadishu. Of course, to outline Somalia's predicament isn't to say that the rest of the world hasn't taken notice. Already, a few nations have begun to step up, including the nations that will support Africa's next mission to Somalia. Slowly but surely, those nations appear to be getting their act together and readying to take part, although the degree to which their purported involvements are actually just bluster, that remains to be seen. Turkey has been making a play for greater regional influence in the Middle East and the African Horn for a couple of years now, and has recently announced plans to almost triple its deployment to Somalia with 800 Turkish soldiers, including 300 commandos and 200 drone operators, expected to be active in the country once all allotted troops have shipped out. The United States still launches its own airstrikes intermittently, and Washington has now shifted its focus from strikes, mostly targeting Islamic State cells, to strikes that seek to eliminate al-Shabaab positions. But other nations assisting Somalia have come under attack too. A mortar attack on a military base near Mogadishu killed 3 Americans and critically wounded 7 Italians, whilst an attack on Ethiopian troops travelling through Somalia caused multiple deaths and injuries. Across the Somali border, an ambush on Kenyan soil killed 5 elite police special operators and injured 5 more. Intervening in Somalia is risky business at the very best of times. And right now, any nation that wants to toss its troops into Mogadishu will have to face the very real prospect of entering the situation America faced in Kabul in the summer of 2021. In this case, however, it's even worse, because while America had years to entrench itself in Afghanistan before the nation fell, any nation that steps up its commitments now is entering a city under siege at the 11th hour. Faced with that prospect, any nation has only 2 options. Go in with enough military force, enough personnel, and enough strategic and political will to break the siege and defeat al-Shabaab directly, or go into Mogadishu with a light enough presence that everyone can get home safely if really hits the fan. At this stage, Somalia's soldiers are no more ready for a fight than the soldiers under Kabul's command in 2021 or under Bashar al-Assad in late 2024. One commonality between those 2 scenarios is that formerly uninvolved nations weren't exactly tripping over themselves to support the losing side. There are other possibilities to consider, potentially leaving Mogadishu in its current state while surging support to Jubaland, Puntland, Somaliland and elsewhere in order to hammer al-Shabaab from the outside while hoping Mogadishu can function as an anvil. But such an unorthodox approach would require either consensus from the international community or an international leader ready to step up and lead the fight. And neither of those options appears likely to materialize. Right now, Somalia is on the brink of utter disaster, with Mogadishu under siege, al-Shabaab in control, and rescue unlikely to arrive in time. Against such a discouraging backdrop, it's worth starting to ask now what a Somalia under the direct control of al-Shabaab might look like. Give the jihadists a few more months to wage a terror campaign on their terms, and they can break Mogadishu. The only question now is whether the world can turn the tides before it's too late. Thank you for watching.